The Pentagon believed in firepower. Tons of ordnance dropped from the sky. Artillery that could level a grid square in minutes. The American way of war was simple. See the enemy, destroy the enemy with overwhelming force. But in the jungles of Vietnam, something happened that the brass couldn't explain. Something that made seasoned U.S. officers turn to their subordinates and say 5 words that would echo through military history. Don't watch them hunt. What could make American commanders issue that warning? What did they see in the Australian Special Air Service that disturbed them so deeply? And why did the Pentagon try to bury the after-action reports that documented kill ratios that shouldn't have been possible? Stay until the end, because the answer reveals a truth about warfare that challenges everything modern militaries believe about technology, firepower, and the nature of combat itself. November 1966, Phuoc Thu Province. The air hangs thick with moisture, the kind that makes every breath feel like drowning. In the Australian base, at Nui Dat, a young American liaison officer watches through binoculars as 4 men disappear into the tree line. They move differently than any soldiers he's seen before. No radio chatter, no equipment clinking. One moment they're visible, the next they're gone, swallowed by green shadow. He lowers the binoculars. His hands are shaking, though he doesn't understand why yet. He will understand in 7 days, when those 4 men return with confirmed kills numbering 23. 4 men, 23 enemy dead. 0 Australian casualties, 0 shots fired in response. The Viet Cong didn't even know they were being hunted until it was over. This wasn't an anomaly. This was Tuesday for the Australian SAS. To understand what happened in those jungles requires going back further, to a philosophy of warfare forged not in Vietnam, but in the deserts of North Africa and the islands of the Pacific during the Second World War. The Australian military had learned something during those years that would set them apart from their allies. They learned that warfare wasn't always won by the side with more guns. Sometimes it was won by the side willing to become something other than human. The Australian SAS traced its lineage to British commando units, but by Vietnam they had evolved into something distinct. While American soldiers were trained to call in support, Australian SAS operators were trained to need nothing. While Americans moved in companies and platoons, Australians moved in 4-man patrols. While American doctrine emphasized speed and firepower, Australian doctrine emphasized patience and precision. The numbers told a story that military analysts initially refused to believe. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS squadrons operating in Phuoc Thu Province achieved confirmed kill ratios that ranged from 30 to 1 to, in some documented cases, 100 to 1. These weren't estimates. These were body counts verified by multiple sources, including American intelligence officers who witnessed the operations firsthand. The Pentagon wanted those numbers. They wanted to understand the methodology. They sent observers, analysts, and training specialists. What they got back were reports that read less like military assessments and more like accounts of something primal. Something that made career soldiers uncomfortable. One report, declassified in 1985, contained a single line that would become infamous among special operations historians. Recommend U.S. personnel not accompany SASR patrols during active hunting operations. Psychological impact on American troops, counterproductive to unit cohesion. Don't watch them hunt. The Australian operators called it the stalk. It was a technique refined over months of jungle operations, a method of movement so slow, so deliberate, that it defied every instinct, screaming at a soldier to move, to act, to do something. An SAS patrol could spend 6 hours covering 100 meters. 6 hours of absolute silence, of breathing synchronized with wind patterns, of placing each foot with such precision that not a single leaf rustled. American soldiers were trained to fear ambush, to move quickly through danger areas, to rely on firepower if contacted. The Australians had inverted the equation. They didn't fear ambush, they were ambushed. They didn't move through dangerous areas. They became the danger. A Viet Cong fighter captured in 1968 during Operation Coburg told his interrogators about the ghost soldiers. He described patrols that disappeared for days, then materialized from the jungle itself. He described finding his comrades dead in their sleeping positions, throats cut, without a sound having been made. He described the psychological terror of knowing that the Australians were out there, somewhere in the green darkness, watching, waiting, selecting their moment with inhuman patience. The interrogation transcript noted that the prisoner wept while recounting these events. He had fought the Americans for 3 years without breaking. The Australians broke him in 3 months. What the American observers saw, when they were permitted to watch, challenged their fundamental understanding of combat. They saw Australian operators spend 45 minutes establishing a firing position for a single shot. They saw men lie motionless in the rain for 16 hours waiting for a target to appear. They saw 4-man patrols track enemy units of 40 or 50 fighters, picking them off one by one over the course of days, never engaging in direct firefight, never revealing their position, until the enemy unit simply ceased to exist. An American Green Beret observer attached to an SAS squadron in 1967 wrote in his personal journal, later published in a military history compilation, "These men don't fight like soldiers. They hunt like predators. There's no other word for it. When they're operational, something changes in their eyes. They stop being human in some fundamental way. It's effective as hell, but it's also deeply disturbing to watch." The Australian method stood in stark contrast to American doctrine in every conceivable way. When Americans made contact with the enemy, they called in artillery, airstrikes, and reinforcements. When Australians made contact, they melted into the jungle and began the hunt. American patrols carried radios, heavy weapons, sometimes even portable generators for command posts. Australian patrols carried weapons, ammunition, water, and nothing else. Every piece of equipment was evaluated on a single criterion: does this help me kill, or does this slow me down? The weapon became the symbol of this philosophy. While Americans in Vietnam carried the M16, a rifle designed for volume of fire, many Australian SAS operators chose the L1A1 self-loading rifle. It was heavier. It carried less ammunition, but it was accurate to 800 meters in the hands of a skilled marksman. The Australians weren't interested in suppressing fire. They were interested in first-shot kills at maximum range. They zeroed their weapons obsessively. Some operators test-fired their rifles every single day, making minute adjustments to ensure that when the moment came, when the target appeared in their sights after hours or days of stalking, that first shot would be fatal, because there often wouldn't be a second shot. The mission depended on the target dying before they knew they were being targeted. American officers who watched this preparation were impressed by the dedication. Then they saw it in action, and the impression turned to something else, something closer to awe, or perhaps fear. Operation Portsea, February 1967. An Australian SAS patrol of 4 men inserted into suspected Viet Cong territory north of Nui Dat. Their mission: reconnaissance and interdiction. For 11 days, they moved through the jungle. American radio operators monitoring their check-ins noted the brevity of their communications. Grid coordinates, weather, nothing else. On day 12, the patrol called for extraction. When the helicopter arrived, the patrol leader handed the pilot a handwritten list. 37 confirmed kills. The pilot radioed back to base, certain there was an error. 4 men couldn't have killed 37 enemy soldiers in 12 days. The patrol leader's response entered military legend: "We could have killed more, but we ran out of time." The after-action report documented the methodology. The patrol had located a Viet Cong supply route. Rather than calling in an airstrike or artillery, they had simply waited. As enemy soldiers moved along the trail, the patrol selected targets methodically. Never more than 2 kills per day. Never from the same position twice. The enemy knew they were being hunted but couldn't locate the hunters. Viet Cong units began refusing to use the trail. Supply lines collapsed. A 4-man patrol had achieved what a battalion-sized operation might have attempted with air support and heavy casualties. The Pentagon wanted to replicate this. They wanted to train American Special Operations units in Australian methods. The problem was that the Australian method wasn't just a set of techniques. It was a mentality, a fundamental reconceptualization of what a soldier was supposed to be. American military culture emphasized the citizen soldier, the man who fought not because he loved war, but because he loved peace and would defend it when called upon. There was something noble in this conception, something that preserved humanity even in the midst of horror. The Australian SAS had set that conception aside. They had decided, consciously and deliberately, that in the jungle they would not be citizens, they would be weapons. They would hunt and kill with the efficiency of apex predators, and they would feel nothing while doing it. An Australian SAS officer, interviewed decades later for an oral history project, described the transformation. When we crossed the wire heading out on patrol, we left our humanity behind. We'd pick it up again when we came back. But out there, in the bush, we weren't men. We were functioning. We were the mission. Everything else, fear, doubt, mercy, those were luxuries we couldn't afford. The American observers saw this transformation and recoiled. Not because it was ineffective, because it was too effective. Because it raised questions about what soldiers should be willing to become in service of their mission. The warning, "Don't watch them hunt," wasn't about protecting operational security. It was about protecting the American soldiers' conception of themselves. If Americans watched the Australians work, they might start to wonder why their own methods were so different. They might start to question the doctrine of overwhelming firepower. They might start to understand that the most effective killers weren't the ones with the biggest guns. They were the ones willing to disappear into the jungle for weeks and emerge having killed dozens of enemy soldiers without ever engaging in a firefight. That realization was corrosive to American military culture. The Pentagon had built an entire war machine around technological superiority and firepower dominance. The Australian SAS proved every night that 4 men with rifles and patience could achieve results that required American battalions and air support. The implications were uncomfortable. If the Australian way worked better, what did that say about the American way? And if the American way was wrong, how many soldiers had died because of that error? The food became a bitter symbol of this divergence. American forward operating bases in Vietnam were supplied with remarkable abundance. Hot meals, ice cream, beer rations. The logistical miracle of keeping American soldiers fed and comfortable in the middle of a war zone was a point of national pride. It demonstrated American industrial might, the ability to project not just military power, but civilization itself into the jungle. Australian SAS patrols carried dehydrated rations that they ate cold. They couldn't risk the smell of cooking food giving away their position. They drank water purified with tablets that tasted like chlorine. They went days without speaking above a whisper. An American soldier could call in a helicopter to deliver hot food. An Australian SAS operator might spend 2 weeks eating cold rice and tinned meat, lying in his own filth, waiting for the perfect moment to kill. The abundance that America was so proud of, the Australians had identified as a vulnerability. Every firebase was a target. Every supply convoy was an opportunity for ambush. The American military had to feed its war machine constantly, and that hunger made it predictable. The Australians had made themselves need nothing, and in needing nothing, they became unpredictable. They became ghosts. A Viet Cong commander's diary, recovered after a firefight in 1969, contained an entry that intelligence analysts found deeply revealing: the Americans we can fight. They come in large numbers with much noise. We hear their helicopters, we see their fires at night, we know where they are. But the Australians we never know. They could be anywhere. They could be watching us now. My men are afraid to sleep. Fear was the weapon. The Australians had understood something that the American doctrine had overlooked. Killing enemy soldiers was tactically useful, but breaking enemy morale was strategically decisive. The SAS didn't need to kill every Viet Cong fighter. They just needed to make every Viet Cong fighter afraid to move, afraid to sleep, afraid to trust the jungle that was supposed to be their sanctuary. The transformation of the jungle from safe haven to hunting ground was psychological warfare of the highest order. The Viet Cong had spent years mastering jungle warfare, learning to use the terrain as both weapon and shield. The Australians had learned to use it better. They had become more patient, more silent, more deadly than fighters who had been born in those jungles. And in doing so, they had inverted the entire dynamic of the war. By 1968, Viet Cong units operating in Phuoc Thu province were showing signs of severe degradation. Desertion rates climbed. Recruitment became difficult because locals knew the Australians were out there. American intelligence officers noted with surprise that enemy activity in Australian operational zones had dropped by more than 60%. Even though Australian troop numbers were a fraction of American strength in other provinces, the Pentagon sent more observers. They wanted to understand. They interviewed Australian commanders, requesting detailed breakdowns of tactics and training. What they received was frustrating in its simplicity. There was no secret. There was no advanced technology. There was just patience, discipline, and a willingness to endure discomfort that exceeded anything American doctrine prepared soldiers for. One Australian sergeant, asked to explain his unit's success to an American colonel, reportedly said, "Your blokes want to go home. My blokes are home. The bush is where we live. Charlie's just visiting." It was a flippant answer, but it contained a profound truth. American soldiers in Vietnam were enduring the jungle, counting days until rotation, thinking about the world they'd left behind. Australian SAS operators had mentally relocated their existence. They weren't in the jungle temporarily. They were of the jungle, part of its ecosystem, as natural to that environment as the leeches and the monsoon rains. This psychological shift enabled physical endurance that seemed impossible. Australian patrols regularly operated for 3 weeks, without resupply. They drank from streams, ate what they carried, and kept moving. American special forces could do similar things, but not routinely, not as standard procedure. The Australians had made the impossible mundane. Operation Overlord. June 1969, an SAS squadron tasked with locating North Vietnamese Army regulars infiltrating south through the jungle corridors west of Nui Dat. 3 4-man patrols inserted. At dawn, for 21 days those 12 men moved through territory controlled by an estimated battalion-strength enemy force. They made no contact, called in no airstrikes, and requested no support. On day 22, they called for extraction. The intelligence they brought back was extraordinarily detailed. Enemy base camp locations, supply caches, movement patterns, command structure, and the body count. 83 confirmed kills. 12 men had killed 83 enemy soldiers while operating deep in enemy territory, outnumbered more than 30 to 1, and had suffered 0 casualties. The American colonel reviewing the report called it impossible. The Australian squadron commander's response was documented in the mission archive. "We didn't think it was particularly remarkable. We were just doing our job." The casualness of that statement horrified the American officers more than the violence itself. These men had spent 3 weeks killing, had ended 83 human lives, and considered it routine. Where was the trauma? Where was the psychological weight? The Americans had psychiatrists, chaplains, support systems, designed to help soldiers cope with the mental burden of combat. The Australians seemed not to need them. In truth, the Australians did carry the weight. They just carried it differently. The culture of the SAS emphasized stoicism, emotional control, and the ability to compartmentalize. Operators were trained to process their experiences internally, to not burden their teammates with doubt or fear. This made them extraordinarily effective soldiers. It also made them difficult men to know, even for their families. A psychological study conducted decades after the war found that Australian Vietnam veterans had higher rates of divorce and social isolation than their American counterparts, but lower rates of diagnosed PTSD. The researchers' conclusion was telling. The Australians had trained themselves so thoroughly to suppress emotional response that they continued suppressing long after the war ended. They had become the weapons they needed to be, and some of them never quite figured out how to become fully human again. The rifle carried its symbolic weight through every operation. While American soldiers often personalized their weapons with engravings or markings, Australian SAS operators kept theirs pristine. No decorations, no names. The rifle was a tool, not a companion. It existed to kill accurately at range, and anything that didn't serve that function was eliminated. But the operators cared for their rifles with obsessive attention. They cleaned them daily, even in the field where the smell of gun oil might compromise a position. They zeroed them constantly. They knew every quirk, every tendency of their particular weapon. An SAS operator could tell you exactly how many clicks to adjust windage at 400 meters in crosswind. They could tell you the precise pressure needed on the trigger for a surprise break. The rifle was an extension of their will and their what was to kill efficiently. American observers noticed this relationship and found it disturbing in ways they struggled to articulate. There was something cold about it, something that suggested these men had reduced combat to pure mechanics. Aim, breathe, squeeze, confirm, kill, move, no anger, no righteousness, just function. A U.S. Army Ranger who trained with the Australian SAS in 1970 later wrote, "They taught me more about shooting in 2 weeks than I'd learned in 3 years of military service. But they also scared the hell out of me. When they looked at the terrain, they weren't seeing the jungle. They were seeing firing lanes, approach routes, kill zones. Everything was measured in terms of how to use it to kill people. That kind of focus is effective, but it's also inhuman. Inhumanity was the point. The Australian SAS had recognized that jungle warfare against a determined enemy required becoming something other than conventional soldiers. They had to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. They had to be more comfortable in the jungle, more patient, more willing to endure discomfort, more efficient at killing. American doctrine couldn't replicate this because American doctrine was built on different foundations. The American way of war was industrial. Mass production, overwhelming resources, technological superiority. Throw enough bombs, bullets, and bodies at a problem, and eventually it would be solved. This approach had worked in World War II. It had worked in Korea, more or less. But in Vietnam, against an enemy that could melt into the population or the jungle, industrial warfare showed its limitations. The Australian approach was artisanal. Each kill was crafted, planned, executed with precision. There was no mass production. There was the hunter and the hunted, the rifle and the target, the patient hours of stalking followed by the single perfect shot. It was warfare reduced to its oldest, purest form. By 1970, the Australian SAS had become legendary among both allies and enemies. Viet Cong prisoners would sometimes refuse to be interrogated by Australian personnel, so intense was their fear. American units operating near Australian areas of responsibility reported decreased enemy activity, even though the Australians were far less numerous than American forces. The kill ratios continued to climb. Some patrols achieved numbers that seemed fantastical, 100 to 1, even 150 to 1. 4 men might spend a month in the jungle and return having killed 40 or 50 enemy soldiers without suffering casualties. The documentation was thorough and verified. These weren't exaggerations or propaganda. They were simply the result of a military force that had optimized itself for a specific type of warfare and executed it with mechanical precision. The American military establishment struggled to internalize the lessons. Some special operations units adopted aspects of Australian tactics: longer patrols, smaller teams, emphasis on stealth over firepower. But the fundamental philosophical divide remained. The Americans wanted to win quickly and go home. Australians were willing to spend months or years in the jungle, killing steadily, breaking enemy morale through relentless predation. The warning, "Don't watch them hunt," became unofficial policy in some American units. Commanders recognized that exposing their soldiers to Australian methods created problems. Men started questioning their own tactics. Why were they carrying so much equipment? Why did they rely so heavily on support? Why weren't they training to move as silently, to shoot as accurately? These were dangerous questions because they suggested that American soldiers were dying unnecessarily, that a different approach might save lives. But changing doctrine meant admitting the current doctrine was flawed. It meant acknowledging that the smaller, poorer Australian military had figured out something the Pentagon had missed. Pride prevented that acknowledgement. So the Australians continued their solitary hunting, racking up kill ratios that defied belief, while American units conducted sweeps and called in airstrikes and counted casualties that might have been avoided. In 1971, as Australian combat forces began withdrawing from Vietnam, American officers who had observed them compiled reports assessing their effectiveness. The conclusions were unanimous in terms of kills per soldier, cost effectiveness, and enemy demoralization. The Australian SAS was the most effective military unit operating in Vietnam. More effective than American special forces. More effective than conventional units with vastly superior firepower. The Pentagon quietly archived these reports. They were too politically problematic to publicize. How could the richest, most technologically advanced military in human history admit that it had been outperformed by a smaller ally using methods that were fundamentally simpler? The rifle stood as a monument to this uncomfortable truth. Not the advanced American weapons systems, not the B-52s or helicopters or artillery batteries. A rifle, a man, patience, and skill. That combination had proven more deadly than all the technological sophistication America could deploy. Years after the war, veterans from both nations would occasionally meet at reunions or military gatherings. American soldiers would ask Australian SAS veterans about their methods, their training, their mindset. The Australians were generally polite, but evasive. What they had done in those jungles was difficult to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. How do you describe the mental state required to lie motionless in the mud for 20 hours waiting for a target? How do you convey the coldness needed to methodically kill dozens of men over weeks without allowing emotion to interfere? One Australian SAS veteran, interviewed for a military history project in the 1990s, came closest to articulating it. We weren't heroes. Heroes feel things: courage, fear, righteousness. We couldn't afford feelings. We were tools, very sharp tools, pointed at the enemy. The men who wielded us were the commanders making strategic decisions. We just did the work. Efficiently, thoroughly, without hesitation. That's not heroism. That's something else entirely. That something else was what had made American officers issue the warning. Not because the Australians were ineffective, but because they were too effective in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about soldiers and warfare. They had proven that the most deadly fighters weren't the ones with the best technology or the most resources. They were the ones willing to surrender their humanity temporarily in service of the mission, the American ideal of the citizen soldier. The man who fights reluctantly but courageously couldn't accommodate this reality. The Australian SAS had become professional killers in the most literal sense. They had made killing their profession, their craft, something to be perfected. Through practice and dedication. There was no reluctance. There was only the mission and the most efficient way to accomplish it. This efficiency had achieved results that saved Australian lives and broke enemy resistance. But it had also created men who carried psychological burdens they would never fully articulate. The cost of becoming inhuman for the mission was that returning to humanity afterward was never quite complete. The jungle had been their hunting ground, and they had been its apex predators. But predators don't fit easily into civilization. They remain always slightly separate, watchful, aware of threat and opportunity in ways that make others uncomfortable. The American soldiers who watched them hunt felt that discomfort viscerally. They saw what effectiveness looked like when divorced from sentiment, and it unsettled them because it suggested paths they could follow but weren't certain they should dot in the end. The warning, "Don't watch them hunt," was less about protecting operational methods and more about protecting the American military's conception of itself. The Australians had shown a different path, a more effective path in that specific context. But it was a path that required sacrifices beyond the physical. It required becoming something other than the citizen soldiers America prided itself on fielding. The Pentagon chose to maintain its doctrine despite the evidence. American military culture chose overwhelming firepower and technological superiority over the patient stalking methodology of the Australians. This wasn't necessarily wrong. Different nations, different cultures, different approaches to warfare. But it meant that American soldiers would continue fighting one way while a smaller Allied force demonstrated that another way might work better. The reports were filed. The statistics were archived. The lessons were noted, but not implemented. And in the jungles of Fuwaktu province, 4-man Australian SAS patrols continued hunting with efficiency that produced kill ratios military analysts would study for decades. The rifle remained the symbol. Simple, precise, deadly when wielded by someone who had mastered its use and mastered themselves. No amount of technological advancement could replace the combination of skill, patience, and willingness to endure that those Australian operators embodied. They had become weapons themselves, human rifles pointed at the enemy with single-minded purpose. They had achieved what the Pentagon couldn't with all its resources. They had won their tactical battles almost without exception, had broken enemy morale in their operational zones, and had returned home having proven that warfare is sometimes won not by the side with more, but by the side willing to become whatever the mission requires. The warning echoes through military history. Don't watch them hunt. Not because the hunting was shameful or ineffective, but because it revealed truths about combat effectiveness that challenged comfortable assumptions. The Australians had hunted men with the patience and precision of apex predators, and they had been extraordinarily good at it. That skill had been necessary, perhaps, but it had also been terrible to witness for those who still believed warfare should retain some element of humanity. In the silence of the jungle, in the long patient hours of the stalk, in the moment of the shot and the falling of the target, the Australian SAS had found a terrible truth, that the most effective killers are not the ones who hate their enemies, but the ones who feel nothing at all, who can reduce combat to pure mechanics, who can hunt and kill as function rather than emotion. This was the lesson American officers didn't want their soldiers to learn. This was why they issued the warning. Not because the Australians were wrong, but because they were too right in ways that couldn't be reconciled with American military culture. So the warning stood. Don't watch them hunt. Let them do their work in the shadows, achieve their impossible. Kill ratios, break enemy units without conventional engagement. But don't watch too closely, because what you'll see is effectiveness purchased at a price American doctrine isn't willing to pay. The price of becoming perfect weapons. The price of hunting men with the efficiency of machines. The price of surrendering humanity in the jungle and spending the rest of your life trying to find it again. That price brought victory in countless small engagements across Fuwaktu province. It created legends that both sides would remember for decades. And it stood as testament to a truth that makes military planners uncomfortable. That sometimes the most sophisticated answer to a military problem is patience, precision, and men willing to become something more than soldiers and less than human. The rifle, the jungle, the patient hunter. These were the elements that produced kill ratios of 30 to 1, 100 to 1. Numbers that shouldn't have been possible. But they were possible because the Australian SAS had looked at warfare and stripped it down to its essence. Not nations or ideologies, or righteous causes. Just the hunter and the hunted, the long stalk, the perfect shot. And in that essence, in that cold mechanical efficiency, they had found the answer to a question the Pentagon had asked. How do you defeat an enemy on their own terrain with fewer resources? You become better hunters. You outpatient them. You outlast them. You kill them one by one until their morale breaks and their resistance collapses. You do it without anger, without hatred, without anything except the cold calculation of the perfect predator. And you do it so well that allies who watch feel compelled to warn others. Don't watch them hunt, because some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some truths about effectiveness and humanity and the price of victory are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Australian SAS acknowledged nothing. They simply continued hunting, continued achieving the impossible, and continued proving every night that 4 men with rifles and infinite patience could break enemy units that American battalions struggled to engage. The warning stood. The hunting continued. And in the archives, the after-action reports documented a type of warfare that was as effective as it was disturbing, as simple as it was profound. Don't watch them hunt, but the numbers don't lie. And the numbers say that they hunted with a precision and effectiveness that changed how military historians understand small unit operations. 4 men, 37 kills, 21 days. 0 casualties. Just another Tuesday for the Australian SAS. Just another mission executed with mechanical perfection in the green shadows of the jungle, where they had become something other than soldiers. They had become the warning itself.